Chapter 7. The Church. In the spring of 1936, Mrs. Simpson wrote a letter to her husband. "Dear Ernest," she wrote, "you have been very kind to me. You are a good and strong man, but I must tell you that our marriage is finished. I am in love with the king, and I want a divorce. Don't be angry. There is nothing you can do. I'll never forget you, but I have to be free." Ernest replied immediately, "Your letter arrived this morning. I will do what you ask, but I'll never stop loving you. And if you need me, I'll always be here." That night the King and Wallis met at a small restaurant in Piccadilly. Edward read Ernest's letter again and again. "That's wonderful news," he said. "Nothing can stop us now." The next day, when Edward came down to breakfast, Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was waiting for him. "Good morning, Gordon," the king said. "How nice to see you again. And what can I do for you?" For a minute the Archbishop said nothing. Then he opened a small black bag and took out 3 newspapers. "I have come to see you about Mrs. Wallis Simpson," he began. "The newspapers say that you want to marry her. Are these stories true, sir?" "Yes, Gordon. Wallis is going to be my wife." "But that's not possible," the Archbishop replied. "You know what the Church thinks about marriage and divorce. Divorce is wrong in the eyes of God." Edward smiled and then said, "Can I ask you some questions about God, Mr. Lang?" "Yes, of course, sir." "Is God happy when 2 people fall in love?" "Yes, sir, but—" "And is God happy when 2 people fall in love and get married?" "Yes, sir, but—" "And is God happy when 2 people fall in love, get married, and live happily together?" "Yes, sir, but—" "Then, Archbishop, Wallis and I will make God very happy. We are in love. We'll get married, and we'll live together happily." "But you don't understand, sir," Mr. Lang replied. "The Church says that divorce is wrong. Mrs. Simpson cannot leave Mr. Simpson and then marry you. You must forget about her and find another woman. Please, sir, I must ask you to think again." "That is not possible," Edward said softly. "When Wallis is free, I shall marry her." There was a long silence. The Archbishop looked down at the floor and shook his head. "You're making a big mistake, sir," he said. "The Church is very strong, and we will not have this woman as our queen." Suddenly, Edward stood up, his face red and angry. "Thank you for coming," he said, "but I have nothing more to say, and I want to be alone." The Archbishop stood up to go, but then turned and touched the King's arm. "Please, sir, think again. The Church will be against you." "I don't care," Edward replied. I have God on my side, and that is all I need. Goodbye, Mr. Lang. Chapter 8. The Storm. In July and August, Wallis and the king sailed the Mediterranean. They met Prime Minister Metaxas in Greece, Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, and King Boris in Bulgaria. But that summer is famous for Edward's clothes. On the journey from Athens to Istanbul, the king took off his shirt to get brown in the sun. It was hot, and 10 minutes later he was asleep. So he did not see the young photographer who was now taking pictures of the king. When Edward returned from the Mediterranean, there was a letter waiting for him. It was from Mr. Albert Thompson of Birmingham, who wrote, "I saw a picture of you in the newspaper this morning, and I felt very angry. I have never seen a king dressed as badly as you were. No shirt and no tie, no socks, no hat, and in short trousers. How could you, sir?" Edward showed this letter to Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister. "What do you think of this?" the king asked. "Mr. Thompson is right, sir," the Prime Minister replied. "You want to be modern, but the people don't like it." Edward put the letter on the fire. "And do you think that divorce is modern, Mr. Baldwin?" The Prime Minister sat down. "Yes, sir," he began. "I've read about this Mrs. Simpson. She has 2 husbands still alive. And you must understand what that means, sir. She cannot marry a king." "But I cannot live without her," Edward said. "Then, sir," the Prime Minister replied, "I can see there's a storm coming. I have talked to your family and to Archbishop Lang, and we will not have this woman as our queen." That night, the Prime Minister and the King spoke for many hours. There were hundreds of questions, but only one answer. And so, in the early hours of the next morning, Edward said, "You tell me that Wallis cannot marry a king. So there is only one thing that I can do. I will give the crown to my brother and leave England. I must follow my heart. You tell me that it's a crime to fall in love. You tell me that it's wrong to be happy. How strange this country is." An hour later, Edward telephoned Wallis. "The Prime Minister says that a storm is coming," Edward said. "So I want you to go away." Wallis packed her bags and left for France. Then Edward went to see his mother. It was a sad, strange, and angry meeting. "Do you know what you are doing?" the Queen asked. "Look out of that window. Outside this palace, there are 400 million people who call you king. They need you. And you will leave all this for Mrs. Simpson? Yes, Mother, I will. I'm in love. Love? Queen Mary shouted. You're a king. You must love your country first. But I'm also a man, Edward said softly. And there's nothing that I can do. That afternoon the king telephoned Winston Churchill, one of his closest friends. I have some sad news, Edward began. Last night Mr. Baldwin came to see me. I have decided to go away next week. Do you mean on holiday, sir? No, Winston. I'm leaving England. I'm never coming back. George will be king. But that's not right, sir. You're a free man. You must stand and fight. No, the king said. I have seen war, and it's a terrible thing. I don't want to fight again. But the people love you, and they want Wallis to be queen. Perhaps they do, Edward replied. But she cannot be queen. My enemies are stronger than I am. I am just a sailor. And when the winds change, the sea moves, and it takes my boat away. Chapter 9. The Woman I Love. A few days later, Mr. Churchill came to see Edward at Buckingham Palace. At first, the king was quiet. Then he said, "This is my last night in England, Winston. I love this country. I wanted to be a modern, kind king. I wanted to change the world, but they stopped me. And now I have to leave." It was 10 o'clock. Edward stood up and walked over to the window. In the dark streets below, there were hundreds of people. They were singing and calling his name. "Edward, Edward, we love Edward," they shouted. "Long live the king! Long live love!" Suddenly, the king turned to Mr. Churchill. "Why is this happening to me, Winston?" he cried. "What have I done wrong?" He sat down and put his head in his hands. There was a silence in the room, but through the open window came the shouting from the street. "Long live Edward! Long live love! Long live Edward! Long live love!" Mr. Churchill came over and put his hand on the king's arm. Edward looked up. "Thank you, Winston," he said. "You were a good friend to me." "Thank you, sir. And you were a good king." At 10 o'clock the next morning the telephone rang in Edward's bedroom. "They're ready for you now, sir," a voice said. The king walked slowly down the stairs. In front of him there was an open door. The family were waiting for him. His mother sat near the window, dressed in black. His brothers stood beside her. "How close they are," the king thought. On a small table in the center of the room, there was a piece of paper. Edward sat down and read these words. "I, Edward the Eighth, King of Great Britain, King of India, King of Australia, King of New Zealand, King of Canada, King of Kenya, King of Nigeria, King of Burma, King of Malaya, King of Singapore, and King of 32 other countries, have today given the crown to my brother George. God be with him and all his people. 10th of December, 1936. Edward took a pen and wrote his name at the bottom of the page. Then he stood up and kissed his brother's hand. "I never wanted this to happen," George said. "This is the worst day of my life." Edward walked over to his mother. "Before I kiss you," she said, "there are some things that I want to say. I have never understood you, child. This morning you were a king, but tonight you'll run from England like a thief. Alone, angry, afraid. You think that you're free, but you're not. You cannot be free. Everyone needs their family. Everyone needs their home. And tonight you have lost both those things. I love you. I am your mother, and nothing can change that. But if you marry that woman, you will break my heart. Go now. It is all very sad." Edward kissed Queen Mary's hand. Then he turned and walked away. The next day Edward returned to Windsor Castle. He went into a small, cold room at the top of the building. From there, he spoke on BBC radio to Britain and the world. This is what he said. "Tonight, for the first time, I can say a few words to you. Earlier today, I gave the crown to my brother George. He is now your king. I will soon leave this country and travel to France. My heart is with Wallis, and I cannot live without the woman I love. I don't know what will happen to me. Perhaps I will never see England again. But think of me tonight when I sail across the sea. God be with you. Long live King George." Edward left Windsor Castle and got into a large black car. It was now midnight, and it was just beginning to rain. "Take me away as quickly as you can," he said. The car moved off into the darkness and the rain. "What a night," said the driver. "I think the sky is crying, sir." At 1:30 a.m., they arrived at Portsmouth. Edward got out of the car, and a voice said, "The king is here." Edward stopped and looked out across the open sea. There was a thin, cold smile on his face. "King," he said. "No, I am not the king. I am just a man in love." Then he turned and walked onto the ship and into the night. Chapter 10. The Wedding. The next morning, Edward telephoned Wallis from Boulogne. "Did you listen to me on the radio?" he asked. "Yes, of course," she said. "And how did you feel?" "I was sitting in my room alone," Wallis said. And when I listened to your words, I felt so sad. I put my hands over my eyes and I just cried. I couldn't stop myself. You have left everything for me. But I love you so much, Edward, and with me you'll be the happiest man in the world. I am that already, he replied. You are all that matters in my life. Edward married Wallis Simpson 6 months later, on the 3rd of June 1937. None of the royal family came to the wedding. Edward was 43, Wallis was 41, and they now took a new name, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. A few weeks later, Edward wrote to his brother, King George. I was surprised that you didn't come to the wedding, he wrote. But Wallis is now my wife, and nothing can change that. As you know, we have a house in Paris, but France is not my home, and I want to live again at Windsor, with Wallis by my side. I'm sorry, Edward, King George wrote back, but you know how I feel about that woman. I do not like her. I will never like her. You can live here, but Wallis cannot. My brother, Edward said later, pushed me away like a dog. I will never forget what he did. And after that, I decided that I didn't want my family. They didn't want Wallis, and so I didn't want them. Chapter 11. Paris. For the next 30 years, the Duke and Duchess lived in Paris. They gave parties and travelled round the world, but they never went back to Buckingham Palace. When King George died in 1952, and Queen Mary died in 1961, Edward returned to Windsor for a few days, but Wallis stayed in France. It's your family, she said, not mine. But then, in 1966, the Duke and Duchess met Queen Elizabeth, the daughter of King George, at a small party in London. After 30 long years, it was time to forget the past. Elizabeth kissed the Duchess and touched her arm. Then she turned to the Duke and said, "Wallis is so beautiful, Uncle. I think you're a lucky man." That day, Elizabeth was very kind to us, Edward wrote later. But why couldn't my mother or my brother say those words to me? On BBC television in 1969, the Duke and Duchess spoke about their life together. "Do you argue?" someone asked them. "No, not really," the Duchess replied. "But there's one thing about my husband that I really don't like. He is always late. It doesn't matter if he's meeting a queen, a president, or a film star. He can never arrive on time. I don't know why. I have tried to change him, but it's just not possible." The Duke smiled and touched her hand. "I know that I'm often late," he said, "but on our wedding day, I arrived at the church 20 minutes before you. I was early and you were late." "Yes, that's true," the Duchess said, and they both laughed. "You could see real love in their eyes," one newspaper wrote. "They were on television, but they forgot about the cameras and the millions of people who were watching. They were just two people in love. The Duchess was famous for her jewelry. "After my husband," she once said, "I love jewelry more than anything else in the world." And after 35 years with the Duke, she had hundreds of pieces, which came from all over the world. "I have never met a more beautiful woman than Wallis," Edward wrote, "and I loved giving her presents. She has given me so much happiness. I buy her jewels to say thank you." In May 1972, the Duke became ill. When the doctor arrived, he listened to Edward's heart and then said, "How many cigarettes do you have a day, sir?" "About 40 or 50, the Duke replied. "But please don't ask me to stop. I've smoked for 60 years, and I cannot change now." That night, Edward called Wallis into the room. "I feel very tired," he said, "and I'm afraid. I love you. I have been very happy with you, and you have been a wonderful wife. When I die, I want you to take my body back to Windsor. Will you do that for me?" "Yes, of course," she said, and they both began to cry. The Duke of Windsor died 1 hour later with Wallis by his side. 3 days later, a blue aeroplane arrived in Paris. Wallis went back to England with the Duke's body, and for the first time in her life, she entered Buckingham Palace. A week later, the Duchess returned to France, and for the next 14 years, she lived alone in Paris. The big house was dark. The doors were locked, and she did not go out. In the afternoons, she sat in the dining room with Edward's love letters. "They were so beautiful," she said. "I read them again and again." But then, in 1986, Wallis became ill. She went to a small hospital near the house, and a few days later she died. "Without Edward," she once wrote, "my life was empty." She was buried in England next to her husband at Windsor. "It's a strange thing," one newspaper wrote. "When they were alive, the Duke and Duchess could never live in Britain. It was only in death that they could be there together." Chapter 12. Long Live Love. In 1970, 2 years before his death, Edward said, "There are some people who think that I was wrong to give away my crown. But they don't understand true love. When I was young, I lived in Buckingham Palace. I could have anything that I wanted, but I wasn't happy because my heart was empty. Then I met Wallis, and everything changed. For half of my life, I have lived here with the most beautiful woman in the world. and she is everything to me. When I sit in my garden, with the Duchess by my side, I sometimes think about my early life. I remember the days alone in my bedroom. I remember the teacher who hit me with a stick. I remember the war and my travels around the world. And then I remember the crowds of people below my window who shouted, "Long live love." On my last night in London, I spoke with Winston Churchill. In the middle of our conversation, he said, "I think, sir, that the best things in life are free." I have never forgotten those words. And now, many years later, I understand what they mean. You cannot buy happiness, and you cannot buy love. To be happy deep inside your heart is the most wonderful thing in the world. I have been a lucky man. And so I say, thank God for Wallis, and long live love.